want to welcome you tonight. My name is Charlene Margot. I am co-founder of nonprofit The Parent Venture. We are honored and delighted to have with us tonight Judge LaDoris Hazzard Cordell. Welcome, Judge Cordell.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Charlene. And thank you for all the people who've registered for this webinar. I'm not going to speak for a long time. I am going to speak a little bit about my book. I'll talk about that in a little, but there's just a bigger issue that we're going to talk about tonight that I want to bring to your attention, and it is about activism. So you may be wondering what a retired trial judge has to say at a program sponsored by The Parent Venture. I know it is the cutting edge provider of professional parent education, as she said, for the last 17 years. And that's a fair question. So, I'm a parent of two daughters, both of whom are doing well, despite my parenting. And I'm a grandmother of 5, all of whom are behaving so far. During my time on the bench, I presided over many cases involving children and teens and parents. In the juvenile court, on the delinquency side, I heard cases in which children and teens were charged with crimes. And on the juvenile dependency side, I had cases where children and teens were neglected and abused, where I had to decide where to place them. So I have seen the damage that poor and outright bad parenting can do to our young people. So I have some images I'm going to show you, and Bev Hartman is going to show them. I asked Bev if you'll put the first image up. Okay, thank you. In my book, Her Honor, I begin with a chapter on juvenile court, where I describe the issues I had to confront in a legal system that is woefully unprepared to address the needs of our children. And one example from my book in a chapter titled Trials and Tribulations in Juvenile Court, and this is a quote from the book: currently, there are over 2,600 inmates who were 17 years of age and younger, some as young as 13 at the time of their crimes, who are serving life sentences without the possibility of parole. Of those child lifers who were 14 years and younger when they committed their crimes, 70% are children of color. So indeed, it was only until 2005 that the US Supreme Court finally deemed it unconstitutional to execute anyone who was a juvenile when they committed their crimes. That was not until 2005. Before that decision, 365 adults have been executed for murders they committed as children, as juveniles. Now, on the happier side, in the chapter, Would You Be Mine?, I wrote about how I was able to bring parents and children together through adoptions, one of my favorite assignments as a judge. But, and this will likely not surprise many of you, as I note in the book, it was not until the 1970s that some of the states had to be forced to approve of interracial adoptions. And the last state, the last holdout, was Louisiana. And that was in 1972. So enough legal talk. There are plenty more war stories in the book, and I hope that you will read them. I want to take some time to talk to you about activism and how all of us, no matter our age or station in life, have the ability to blossom into activists. After all, activism is at the core of the work of the Parent Venture. Next image. The Oxford Dictionary defines activism as the policy or action of using vigorous campaigning to bring about political or social change. Here's how others define it. Next image. According to author and activist Maya Angelou, activism means picking up the battle and making it a better world just where you are. Next image. Academic and political activist Angela Davis says activism means no longer accepting the things we cannot change and changing the things we cannot accept. Next image. The late, great John Lewis, civil rights leader and congressman, described activism like this: when you see something that is not just, not fair, or not right, you have to do something. You have to say something. Make a little noise. It's time for us to get into good trouble, necessary trouble. Next image. Singer and activist Joan Baez has said that activism is the antidote to despair. Next image. Alice Walker, poet, author, and social activist, says that activism is our rent for being on the planet. Now, I'm the first to admit that it is very difficult to think about activism at a time when this country is so divided, when arguing has replaced conversation, when public health has been politicized, and when our nation's highest court has been weaponized by 6 conservative justices gone rogue. Those 6 have turned their backs on the efforts to stop climate change by limiting the power of the Environmental Protection Agency. They have blood on their hands by allowing anyone 18 years of age or older to own and carry guns in public. They have handed control over the reproductive rights of women to the whim of male-dominated state legislatures, and they will likely eliminate the consideration of race in college admissions. So how do we remain positive without being Pollyanna-ish about what is happening in this country? How do we stay motivated and instill hope in our parents and in our children? And what does activism have to do with it? I think that the answers lie first in knowing our history. It is in knowing from whence we have come, in understanding the struggles of those activists who came before us, that we can know how to move forward. And as importantly, that we can move forward. Next image. Dolly and Easter were my maternal great-great-grandmother and great-grandmother. Both mother and daughter were among the enslaved and were eventually freed with Lincoln's signing of the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863. After the Civil War, they settled in Weldon, North Carolina, where my mother and her siblings were born. Dolly and Easter were pieces of property who belonged to a white slave owner. They had no say over their reproductive rights. They had no right to vote. They had no right to an education. They had no right to practice the religion of their choice. And yet, here I sit, the great-granddaughter who for 20 years was a state court judge and who has written a memoir about that experience. Next image. My parents survived Jim Crow as they and their parents joined the Great Migration from the South to eventually settle in Ardmore, Pennsylvania, where I was born and raised. And this is what I wrote about them in my recently published book, Her Honor. Lewis and Clara Hazzard had worked hard to provide for us and to ensure that my 2 sisters and I went to college. Their mothers had been the help. Domestic workers who toiled for next to nothing, serving wealthy white families who resided in Philadelphia's prestigious Main Line suburbs. When my mother, a high school graduate, and my father, a graduate of North Carolina Agricultural and Technical College, married in 1943, they had neither an inheritance nor a nest egg to get them started. What they did inherit, though, was a terrific work ethic and a powerful drive to succeed. My parents would come to own a home and operate Spring Cleaners, a dry cleaning business that supported our family for 40 years. So my point is that even though it took us a while, there were enough good people in this country who had the courage to protest, to fast, to demonstrate, to pass laws, and to render court decisions that ended enslavement, America's original sin, and then opened the doors of opportunity to women, people of color, the disabled, and the LGBTQ communities. This is why I am able to remain ever hopeful about the future of this country. I believe that there are just 2 kinds of people in the world: bystanders and upstanders. Bystanders are the people who sit by or stand by. They're on the sidelines. And when injustice raises its ugly head, they stand by. They throw up their hands and they do nothing. They sigh, they complain, and they hope for someone to come along to do something. The upstander stands up speaks up, sings up, lawyers up for justice. Upstanders are ordinary people like you and me who speak up even when we are afraid, even when it is far easier to simply remain silent. Next image. King Christian X of Denmark was an upstander. When the Nazis during World War II invaded his country, they ordered all the Jews to sew yellow stars onto their coats and jackets so that they could be readily identified, then rounded up and sent off to concentration camps to be killed. King Christian quietly and bravely sewed a yellow star on his clothing. Next image. Then all the citizens of Denmark, Jews and Christians, followed his lead and sewed yellow stars on their clothing. The result was that the Nazis could not distinguish who were Jews and who weren't, so they left Denmark in frustration. By quietly picking up a needle and thread, King Christian X became an upstander who helped save the lives of thousands of Jews in his country. Next image. One of the world's greatest upstanders was Cesar Chavez, who stood up for farm workers, starting right here in California. Next image. He organized the United Farm Workers Union, frequently with another upstander, Dolores Huerta, at his side. Cesar marched, he protested, he fasted until that movement spread to Texas, Wisconsin, and Ohio, and it succeeded in protecting the rights of farm workers. Next image. Bree Newsom, an African-American woman in her 30s who lives in Charlotte, North Carolina, is an upstander. 10 days after a shooter killed 9 Black people at the Emmanuel AME Church in South Carolina, at 5:30 in the morning on June 27th, 2015, Bree Newsom and her friend Jimmy Tyson, a white guy, went to the Confederate monument right next to the South Carolina State House. Next image. They walked to the 30-foot-high steel flagpole that stood directly behind the monument. After Jimmy helped Bree over a fence, she donned her climbing gear and began to quickly scale up the pole. And Jimmy watched from below, ready to break her fall if she slipped. Guards at the State House saw Bree and began running, shouting at her to come down. Bree ignored them and reached the top of the flagpole, grabbed the Confederate flag and unhooked it. She lowered herself slowly along with the flag. And the Confederate flag, as we all know, had been flown by states in the South that supported slavery. And today, some states continue to fly this symbol of racial hatred. Next image. As soon as she reached the ground, Bree and Jimmy were arrested. And within an hour, 2 State House workers raised a new Confederate flag. Bree and Jimmy were charged with defacing state property that carried penalties of up to 3 years in prison and a $5,000 fine. Their bail was set at $3,000 each. However, that bail was quickly paid by a bail fund that raised more than $150,000 for them to fight their legal case. Later, when asked about this ordeal, Bree Newsom said, and I quote, "The retaliation piece was much scarier to me than the arrest. I was even thinking about the possibility of being up on that flagpole, and you never know who might walk by. Quite frankly, I could have been shot." 2 weeks after Bree Newsom scaled the flagpole and removed the flag, then Governor Nikki Haley, a Republican, signed into law the permanent removal of the Confederate flag from State House grounds. Next image. Nikki Haley would never have done so without the heroic act of Bree Newsom. Bree became an upstander by simply climbing up a pole. But I warn you, being an upstander is risky business. By standing up for others, you risk being ostracized or shunned, sometimes by those whom you thought were your friends. And believe me, I know of what I speak. In 1994, I incurred the anger of many in the African-American community in San Jose and beyond when I spoke out against a Black woman who had recently been elected to the San Jose City Council. Her name was Kathy Cole. Next image. Now I show you this. This is the cover of an issue of Jet magazine. Jet magazine is a national Black publication. The article that I'm going to tell you about was not in this particular edition, but I wanted just to get a sense and see what this Jet magazine looks like. So here's what was written about what happened to me in the May 1994 edition of Jet magazine. Next image. This is from the article. San Jose City Councilwoman Kathy Cole recently was removed from office after angering constituents with remarks and gestures which were offensive to Latinos, Asians, and gays. Cole, who represented the Evergreen District in southeastern San Jose for 15 months, became the first council member in the city's history to be voted out of office. A total of 59.2% of voters favored her recall. The article continues, Cole, 47, whose district, which is approximately 1/3 Asian American and 1/4 Latino, made the remarks last May during an African American leadership conference. Cole said that Latinos sought power, quote, like little pit bulls, then tugged at the corner of her eyes to symbolize Asian features and intimated that Asian Americans and gays got special treatment at City Hall. And the article concludes, Superior Court Judge LaDoris Cordell, that would be me, a Black official who was outraged by Cole's remarks, brought the closed doors statement to light by publicly reprimanding Cole and providing local media with a videotape of the councilwoman's actions. Now, some in the Black community rose up to defend Kathy Cole and to attack me. To them, I was the problem. And I recall one day after Kathy Cole had been recalled, going to the post office that was right next door to the courthouse where I was then presiding. And a Black woman who I did not know, who was furious with me about my role in the Kathy Cole affair, accosted me, got in my face, and loudly denounced me for speaking out against a sister. And I quietly told her that anyone who preaches hate is no sister of mine. Still, it hurt to be impugned by my own community. And yes, that was a risk I chose to take. And you know what? I'd do it again in a heartbeat. Next image. And more recently, in 2020, working with the ACLU of Northern California, I was one of the lead plaintiffs in a lawsuit against the city of Palo Alto, where I live, demanding that the city remove its residents-only entry restriction to its wonderful nature preserve that was a public park. And underlying this restriction was racism. The predominantly white residents of Palo Alto, this is back in the day, didn't want those people in their park. So it was off limits to all but the city's residents for more than 60 years. Next image. As a result of filing that lawsuit, we won. The city council backed down and lifted the restriction. Public park means just that, open to the public. Next image. Charles Hamilton Houston was a brilliant lawyer. When he started his law practice in 1924, it was he who pioneered the idea of using the Constitution to promote racial justice. The grandson of slaves, Houston was born in Washington, D.C. in 1895. He went to Amherst College, and after serving in the Army, attended Harvard Law School, becoming the first Black member of the Harvard Law Review. He was a teacher at Howard Law School and later became its dean, and one of his students was Thurgood Marshall. Next image. Houston devised the long-range strategy that ultimately led the U.S. Supreme Court in Brown versus Board of Education to declare that segregated public education was unconstitutional. Houston died in 1950, 4 years before the Supreme Court decided Brown and made his vision a reality. Houston was fond of saying to his Howard Law students, a lawyer's either a social engineer or a parasite on society. And by being social engineers, I think that Houston meant that all of us, whatever professions we choose, we all should be about the business of making a difference, of using our skills to make this world a better and more just place. So it could mean two activists like Charlene and Bev, who decided not to be bystanders, but to instead stand up and create the parent venture. It could mean all of us having the courage to be a part of uncomfortable conversations about race. Or it could mean a retired judge who uses her time to make the criminal legal system more just. The last chapter of my book is titled, "In My End is My Beginning." And in it, I wrote how my activism blossomed after I retired from the bench. I'm just going to read you a short excerpt before I close. It was, just bear with me a second here. It was 2:17 p.m. on September 8th, 2009. I had been retired from the bench for 8 years. As Judge Peter Espinosa entered his Los Angeles courtroom, I rose and stood next to Kelly Turner, a Black woman in her early 40s. The judge took his seat and said, "This is a hearing on a writ of habeas corpus. I'm in receipt of all of the pleadings. They've been reviewed in preparation for today's hearing." 3 years earlier, I had written an op-ed against California's draconian three strikes law for a local newspaper that came to the attention of Montel Williams, host of a popular national television talk show based in New York City. I accepted his invitation to appear on the show, and in September 2006, I went there and talked about my view of the law. The other guests on his show were two Black women whose sister, Kelly Turner, was in her 11th year of a 25 to life sentence for a third strike, possession of a stolen check in the amount of $144. In August 2009, after 2 years of researching and writing, a lawyer who worked with me completed a petition for a writ of habeas corpus, a request for Kelly's release due to a sentencing error, and lodged it with the Los Angeles County Superior Court. By then, Kelly was in her 14th year of incarceration for possession of a stolen check. Next image. So this is a photo of me in the Los Angeles courtroom in 2009. And sitting there is Kelly. She's in the blue there, and next to her is the prosecutor in Los Angeles, who, after reviewing the legal work that the attorney who volunteered to do this with me, his name was Roy Bartlett, agreed with our petition. So this is right after the judge had ruled that Kelly could be freed. Next image. This is the lawyer, Roy Bartlett, a corporate lawyer who volunteered, did entirely pro bono to work with me. That took 2.5 years to complete the petition that ended in Kelly's freedom. You can see Kelly still has handcuffs on, even though she was going to be freed. She wasn't permitted to have those cuffs off in the courtroom. Next image. In the back of the courtroom, there were Kelly's sisters who 2.5 years before I had met for the first time on the Montel Williams show, and a few other friends. Now, before we go to the next image, I just want to let you know, this is my favorite. This is what freedom looks like 1 year after Kelly's release. Next image. There's Kelly in the middle, and there are her two sisters. That's 1 year. That's what freedom looks like. Kelly has done great. She lives in Central California. She got married. She got a driver's license, a passport. She's traveled to Italy. And 2 years ago, she received an award from California State Probation Department for her work on behalf of children. It's a great picture. So as I wrap up, one of the most extraordinary women to ever walk this earth, a woman who had no formal education, who was illiterate, and if she had had the opportunity, would have been a terrific judge or legislator or teacher or engineer or mathematician, you name it. A woman who faced unimaginable adversity and lived to tell about it. And she said this: every great dream begins with a dreamer. Always remember, you have within you the strength, the patience, and the passion to reach for the stars to change the world. Next image. Those words were spoken by Araminta Ross. I'll say her name again, Araminta Ross, one of 11 children born into slavery in Maryland in March in 1822. When she was not yet 30, she began her career as an activist. Her reputation for heroism and challenging slavery was already well established when the Civil War broke out in 1861. Legally still enslaved, Araminta Ross risked capture by joining the Union's front lines to defeat Confederate rebels and win slavery's abolition. Next image. She served as a nurse, a relief worker among enslaved refugees, a scout, and a spy. And when it seemed that her work was done, it wasn't. She eventually settled in Auburn, New York, where she established a home for aging and indigent African Americans, many of whom, like her, had little means of support during their last years. Even late in her life, her activism continued to blossom as she promoted efforts to win voting rights for Black and white women until her death in 1913 at the age of 91. Who is Araminta Ross? You've all heard of her. Next image. She would eventually change her name to Harriet Tubman. The woman made good and necessary trouble on so many fronts. So in closing, may we, in the spirit of Harriet Tubman, blossom into activists to change the world and pay our rent for being on this planet. Next image. Let us move onward, and thank you so much. I'll give it back to Charlene.
Well, thank you so much, LaDoris. You just give me chills. It was just beautiful. And everyone who's with us tonight, I want you to know that her book, and look, don't you love these floating emojis?
I just love them.
Her book reads like a novel. It is filled with personal stories of people that she interacted with. We're in her courtroom. I think we have with us tonight an attorney who actually argued a case in front of you, who's in the audience.
Oh my goodness.
So anyway, just so exciting. We're working on getting the slides down. Give us a moment.
Sure.
LaDoris, I think let's start with this question.
Okay.
I'd love to hear what inspired, perfect, thank you, Bev. What inspired you to write this memoir, and tell us about those letters from your parents.
Sure. So the entire time I was on the bench for nearly 20 years, I never thought about writing a book. And but what I did write, my last 8 years on the bench, I wrote letters to my parents every Friday afternoon. Why Friday afternoon? Because that's usually downtime if you're a trial court judge, because you're getting the files to prepare for the hearings for the next week. My parents loved hearing about the things that happen in the courtroom. And when you're a trial judge, there's just so much drama. And so I wrote them letters. And I'm not talking emails, Charlene. I'm talking letters with an envelope and a stamp.
Yep,
right?
yep.
And I think it's sad that in this age of social media, we've gotten away from letter writing. And for me, it was so cathartic. My parents loved getting the letters. Okay. So after I retire, so that's 8 years, every Friday, writing letters. And I wrote about the cases, the names of the litigants, the names of the lawyers. I wrote about the decisions I made and how I felt, because I'm writing to my parents, right? All right, so I go back east after I retired. I visit my parents in Ardmore. And during the visit, my mother, who was very organized, she said, "What do you want me to do with these?" And she pulled this box out of our middle room closet. In the box were all the letters I had written. She had saved every letter. And understand, I didn't make copies. These were just letters to my parents. So I packed them up and sent them back out here to California. And it took me about 3 years to start to just reread these letters. And I was just shocked by the volume, the variety of cases over which I presided. And that's when I decided that maybe there was a book here. So it was really, but for these letters, I would never have written a book.
See, I think anyone who's planning on writing a memoir needs to start about 40 years ago, right? They either need to keep journals from the beginning or write wonderful letters like that. My longtime best friend from Palo Alto recently sent me back my own letters during our sort of very formative years, like in our 20s. It was so fun to read those letters.
Wow.
So one of the things that I would love to know is, why did you decide to become a judge?
So for some people, wanting to become a judge or a lawyer was this lifelong dream. That was not the case for me at all. There had been no lawyers in my family. No one had ever gone into the law. So when I went off to college, and by the way, my parents didn't have the opportunities for my sisters. I'm a middle of 3 sisters to go to college, but they knew we were going. It was just a question of where. And so I went off. I decided to be a Spanish major and studied in Mexico. I came back disillusioned with that experience because there was so much racism that I saw in Mexico and among the darker skinned people, the indigenous people, and the lighter skinned ones. I changed my major to theater, and it was then a decision about what do I do after college with a theater major. And I decided I didn't want to go on and try to make it in New York or in Hollywood. And so I kind of ruled out things. I'm not strong in math and the sciences. And really the law was kind of left. And I just took a chance and applied to law schools. And I will tell you, the first year of law school was not a happy time for me at all. I was the only Black woman in my class. I had this big afro, and there were no professors of color at Stanford, and there were no female professors. So I didn't see people who looked like me who were in charge of these classes. And it all changed during my time there because I ended up meeting the first female professor, Barbara Babcock, came in then. But even more than that, I took a clinical course in juvenile law. What's clinical? It means you're actually in a courtroom practicing the things you're learning in the classroom. And that's when I got hooked. And I knew that I wanted to be a litigator. And really, that's really how it kind of took off. So judging wasn't in it for me. So when I went to court, I was mostly always the only Black attorney there. There were no judges that I saw who looked like me in Santa Clara County or San Mateo County. And however, I just felt that if I ever had the chance to be on the bench, if I ever had the chance, that I would treat people with respect and not condescend to them. So I'll just leave a teaser. In the first chapter of the book, it's called Bitten by the Judge Bug. And it is the story about how judging really came into my life and was all about hair, Black women's hair.
That was a great story. It was a great story. All right. If we're not going to tell the story, though,
nope, that's
people
a teaser.
need to read the book and read it. Okay. You write, I love the law. Being a lawyer and then a judge were my calling. So most of us, and I have a son who's an attorney, assume that you get special training to be a judge. But we found out that that is not the case, is it? I was so impressed that if you could tell us a little bit about how when you were handling adoptions and placements and custody battles, you even went and took a course from our friend Eleanor Maccabee in child development at Stanford, who I studied with.
Wow. So the big shocker, and this is true not just California, this is just, again, this book is about being a trial judge, which means we are the judges that are on the front line. The first people you see when you go in a courtroom or interact in the legal system are trial judges. There is no special training to be a judge. So you go to law school. What do you do in law school? You take these various courses and you do them for one reason, and that is to memorize as much as possible so you can pass the bar exam. Then you can forget about it all, because then you get hired maybe by a law firm, or you go to be a public defender or a DA. And that's when you learn about the law. If you're going to be a litigator, for example, and not everyone litigates, you could be a professor, whatever. If you decide to go on the bench, the general rule is you have to have been a lawyer for at least 10 years. But what does that mean? Well, it could mean for 10 years, you did transactional law, which means you sit in your office and you do contracts. And one day you decide, I want to be a judge. So you either get appointed or you run for election, and now you're a judge, and your first assignment is family court, where you have to decide custody of children. Contracts, there's no training. So it's like learn by trial and error, which doesn't happen in any other profession. I write about this in the book, and I bemoan the fact that there is not this training. Now, California has a judges college, and brand new judges are required to go there for, it's either a week or 10 days. So maybe it's the 10 days, 2 weeks, and you got to get a sense of all the different kinds of things judges do. But that's not going to give you the background you need to decide who is the best parent when you're deciding custody of a child. Or if someone is in a psychiatric facility, it is a trial judge who decides if that person can be released. Well, where do we get the training? There is none. So that is a problem, which I address in the book, and I actually kind of come up with some solutions for that. There's a chapter in the book called The Fix, where I write about 10 things that all of us can do to try to make our legal system more fair and just.
All right, that brings us to kind of let's take one heavy question. Let's try this one.
Okay.
Parent asks, my teen is devastated by the racially motivated police brutality we're seeing. When the police are caught on video, it seems out of control. How can we make a difference?
So this is a very important question. I have 3 grandsons of color, I'm very concerned about their future and their ability to thrive, particularly when we have issues regarding the police. So I was the independent police auditor for the city of San Jose, the 10th largest city in the United States, for 5 years. And I learned a lot about policing. I am not a hater. I found some very decent, good people who wear the uniform. That's not the issue. It's not about a few bad apples. What we're talking about is, then this question brings it up, the culture of policing in America. And that's what has to be addressed here. So yes, it's important that we have body-worn cameras, but in the latest incident regarding Tyree Nichols, several of the officers turned off their cameras or left them in their cars. But for the sky cam that was up on a post, we would not have seen the horrible sight of Mr. Nichols being murdered. So it is a culture that has to be addressed. And to understand this, one has to start getting facts and learning about policing. This question is so loaded that it would take a whole nother session to talk about policing, to talk about the superpowers that the Supreme Court has given to police. But there are so many things that we can do as citizens, as lay people, to change this system of policing. But understand, it's about changing a culture and deciding, what do you want police in your community to do? Do you want armed police to make traffic stops? If so, what kind? Most frequent interactions between the public and police are traffic stops. And we have all of these incidents, and I can just rattle them off to you, that arose out of traffic stops where people, most of whom are people of color, are dead or paralyzed. So it's a loaded question. There is a lot to do. And the person who asked and the young person who is concerned about this, do not give up hope. There are many things that are happening, and I can't even start to give you all of the info, but maybe some other time we'll have that discussion.
Okay, thank you, Judge Cordell. I think that is one that we need to have. So here's a related question from a parent. How can I help my kids understand the legal system, how it works and how it needs to improve? Their view of the court system comes mostly from TV.
Yes. And Lord help us, because if you watch these court
Judge
TV
Judy.
shows and all, oh God, I mean, she's entertaining. She does it all wrong. She's entertaining. All right. So the first step, go to court.
Go to court.
Go sit in the courtroom and watch. These courtrooms are yours. Your tax dollars pay the salaries of everybody working in that court. Public defenders, DAs, bailiffs, judges, court reporters, everybody, they work for you. So people are afraid to go sit in a courtroom. These are public unless they are closed by law, and generally juvenile proceedings are not open to the public, but most proceedings are open. You go and sit and watch and observe. What is that judge doing? Why is that judge yelling? Why is the judge starting late? Why? And then, or that's a terrific person up there on the bench, or watch a jury trial. Serve on a jury. I have a whole chapter in the book called Thank You for Your Service. It's all about juries and about, well, we can do better, even dealing with juries. So the first step is, do not be intimidated. These folks work for you. Your tax dollars pay them. Go to court, look, observe. And then if you're a young person who maybe, well, maybe you're in college and you have the summer, you can go maybe say, I want to volunteer and work in a public defender's office or in the DA's office or work in a law office and just kind of be there and observe. It's unpaid if you can work that, meaning afford to do that, and get a sense of what it's like from that perspective. So those are the kinds of things I really encourage people to do, and anyone can do it. Go to court, serve on a jury. That's the first step.
Okay, great steps. So Judge Cordell, I know that for many years you visited our students in the local high schools. What would you be talking to them about?
Oh my goodness, everything. I mean, the first thing I tell young people is, if you're unhappy about the systems and everything's wrong, and let's just the legal system, then what are you doing? Your first step is, have you registered to vote if you're at least 18? The first thing you should do, don't talk to me if you're 18 and you haven't registered to vote. I don't want to hear from you. You mean nothing. Register to vote. That's the first step. So those who will turn 18, and generally I talk to high schoolers, I tell them that's your first birthday present when you're 18 is go register to vote. And then of course to vote. But the things I talk about are issues they're concerned about, a lot of times it's about what are your rights? What are your rights as a student? The officer comes in and wants to search your locker, or you're driving in your car and you get pulled over, or you're just sitting quietly in a park and let's say a police officer comes up and wants to talk to you. Do you have to talk? So I particularly when I was a police auditor, gave many talks in high schools and middle schools about what your rights are. When you're in public, can you take a photo or video of police in public? Of course you can, because you're in public. As long as you're not interfering, you can. That doesn't mean officers won't yell at you. That's wrong of them. And again, I don't want to leave the impression that everything police do is wrong. That is not the case, not at all. The first thing we do when we're in trouble is we call 911. So that's not the issue, but there are so many things that need to be made right. So I try to explain the basics about our legal system. And that's why this book is for everyone, because I give a history. I talk about where did our juvenile courts come from? Why don't juveniles have the right to a jury trial in juvenile court? Why not? Well, in some states they do, in some states they don't, but I talk about the whole history of that. So there's a lot in there, a lot to unpack.
Okay, thank you. I know those talks were very welcome. Maybe someday we can do that again. It's so important. I don't think kids know. For example, here's a question from a parent. My teen thinks because he's underage, not much can happen to him if he's doing something illegal, like marijuana in public. How do I impress upon him that there can be real consequences?
Well, first of all, you're right that it's not can be, there are major consequences. What you don't want to do as a young person is ever get pulled into this legal system, ever, because you get labeled and then that stigma is there. So if you think, well, I'm under 18, I'm 17 or 16, and even if I get busted, it's not a deal because it's a juvenile, it's a record. And if it is a major offense, those records follow you through the rest of your life. And so the way to really bring this home, particularly if you have a young person who's like, oh, what's the big deal? Then I suggest the following: contact a public defender. There, I don't know in every state, but California, there's a public defender's office, and say, may my son come and just sit in juvenile court, delinquency court for a day and watch the proceedings? And you'll likely find a public defender say, yeah, absolutely. And it is an eye opener. When you see these kids coming in handcuffs and sitting there in these outfits they have to wear in juvenile hall, and how their freedom is restricted, and the things that happen in the courtroom, it will change the view considerably, because no one wants to be in that situation. No one. So that's what I say to the arrogant young people who think they know everything. You don't. And the best way to find out is not to preach and yell at them. Let them see, take them. How many of them have actually been to juvenile hall and seen what it looks like in there and what those rooms and cells look like? It's horrible. Not good. Not good.
Yeah. And yet so many of our kids seem to be attracted to the cool kids who are breaking rules or breaking laws. Maybe it sounds minor now, but as you say, spend a day in court, right? No, she's shaking her head. Don't go there.
Don't go there.
Parent asked then, LaDoris, what are some of the common juvenile cases that we see today?
Well, first of all, if we're talking juvenile delinquency, those are children, young people under 18 who are charged with crimes in the juvenile court, because some juveniles, if the crimes are of a certain nature, end up being tried in adult court and treated as adult. So the crimes just vary, everything from shoplifting to drug possession to robberies to battery, assault and batteries. They're every kinds of crime. I've seen them all. I presided in the juvenile court, and it's heartbreaking. It's just heartbreaking. And because for a long time, juvenile courts have become more and more punitive. And that wasn't the purpose of juvenile courts, because they're not fully developed. Their brains aren't fully developed, and they do stupid things. They use poor judgment. So we're tending now with criminal legal reform to try to bring back this whole concept in juvenile court of saying this is, these young people are better than the worst things they have ever done, and that we should not give up on them. And I'm a firm believer of that. Have I met some juveniles that are just so damaged that there's no hope? Yeah, I have. I could probably count them on one hand. But for the most part, no. And I say the system must never give up on our young people, never. So we have to figure out ways, and it's happening with people who are very creative and judges who are very creative and coming up with ways to address the behavior that is violating the law, but looking also at who this person is and why the person is doing this. So providing psychological support, emotional support. And by that, I'm not saying every juvenile is perfect and they're all, the little angels and they did a little something wrong. No, because I have seen some really bad stuff. But I've also had an opportunity to look in the background of these young people to see why they even came there. And I have not given up hope on them. And most people who are working in the juvenile system who have this mindset, they're wonderful. And they're trying to do the best they can to get these young people to be productive in society and not be locked up.
So again, Judge Cordell, I'm disappointed to see that despite the new brain research, right, showing that our kids' prefrontal cortex doesn't really develop till their mid-20s. You're a parent, I'm a parent, I know that. Why is there some backsliding and starting to sentence kids again as adults? You would think brain research would say, hey, case closed. Don't do.
At the same time, you would think that public health, when they say that, there's a problem with COVID, people would buy into it. They don't.
Yeah.
So what has happened is that in our criminal legal system, by the way, I don't call it a criminal justice system because we have a lot further to go before we attain justice. But in the legal system, we have in this country become more punitive.
Mhm.
We are a punitive society that tends to just want to, vengeance. And it's very hard to get through to folks who just have that mindset. And it's troubling, but at the same time, I just believe there are many people who are not of that mindset. But if you just talk generally to people, punish them, and in fact, in this country, America, we even with adults, tend to give far heavier sentences for similar conduct in other countries, let's say in Europe. So we're highly punitive. And the very case I talked about of Kelly, and the 3 strikes law, that's mandatory minimum sentences. It says we paint everybody with the same brush. If you committed this crime, and this is the 3rd time, you're out. I don't care about what provoked it. I don't care about your background. You're out and you're just away for life. Well, who pays for those folks who are now sitting in prison for the rest of their lives? We do. They're not getting any rehabilitation. They're rotting in prisons. So we have moved away. We're starting to move away from mandatory minimums, 3 strikes laws, but there still exists. And that's why I brought the case of Kelly to your attention.
Mhm.
There's no way she should have been in a life sentence for trying to pass a stolen check. Now, she broke the law, no question. But by the time she got out, she had already served 14 years.
Mhm.
14 years. No, that's a waste of a life.
Yeah, absolutely. I went back to grad school in my 50s, which was interesting, right? I was older than all the professors and the kids were all like, 21.
How
But
did that feel?
it was kind of a good, terrible thing to experience. Really, I enjoyed it. But I took a course called Gender, Race, Inequality in the Law. And once you hear and see how inequality impacts our courts, you can never unsee it. Obviously, you saw it firsthand.
Oh, did I? And I write about it in the book. And so here I am, a Black woman. I'm on the bench. There are defendants coming into my courtroom who look like me, predominantly Black and brown people. And here I am, when you're a judge, you take an oath to uphold all of the laws, not the laws you like, all of the laws. And here I am having to sentence predominantly Black and brown people to life sentences under a law, 3 strikes law, that was draconian, one that and yet, so I had this constant conflict. And I had Black and brown people coming into court, looking at me and saying, oh, there's somebody who looks like me. I have hope. I can trust this person's good. So there are all these pressures. And I write about that in the book very honestly about what it feels like to be the only one or to be the first. And then in a system that I know is not fairly treating everyone equally and fairly. It still isn't, but it's in my view, it's a work in progress. It's a work in progress. I left, as I wrote in the book, I left because of that. I just couldn't do it anymore and decided, what can I do to change the system from on the outside? And that's the story of Kelly.
Well, we were very honored to hear you say, LaDoris, that you consider us activists, and we love that. So
You are.
Here's a good question. Hersha writes, how do we encourage more people to be upstanders? I consider myself one, but how do we motivate our youth?
There are many answers to that question. Thank you for the question, first of all. So one way to not motivate youth is to lecture them, is to lecture. It doesn't work. It doesn't work for human beings in general. You get up and lecture about, racism is bad, and because people get defensive. I'm not a racist. Some of my friends are Black and brown. However, we have biases. All of us, we do. So what's the best way to get people motivated to maybe volunteer or just to go discover the things, more about our legal system, for example? It's really by example. And I think about my parents. My parents were community activists. They had this dry cleaning business, which was really the center of the Black community in Ardmore, where people would come, when stuff was going down, if there was a police problem, they'd come to spring cleaners. And I watched my parents just, wow, just do their thing. They never preached to us about doing anything. We were there when my mother organized picket lines, when we had concerns about education in the community. She involved me. I was able to, we didn't have cell phones then. We had phone. You get on the phone and you line up people for the next day. So it's really showing our young people by, first of all, doing it, but also exposing them to just so many different kinds of things that are going on in our communities. And there's so much stuff. So for example, there are some folks I know, I live in Palo Alto, right, who don't know anybody in East Palo Alto. Now, East Palo Alto is literally across the freeway. It's in a different county, and it was predominantly a Black and brown community and lower income than here in Palo Alto. And I know people, good people, didn't know anybody there, wouldn't even think of going there. And I'm like, excuse me, this is why we have to, get out and interact, volunteer, work together, come up with projects that bring people together. There are all kinds of ways. My way of doing it, I co-founded the African American Composer Initiative to bring the music of Black composers to the world. And where did we hold our concerts? In East Palo Alto, at Eastside College Prep, in their beautiful Center for Performing Arts. And it brings people together who've never even been in the community. There's so many ways. And you know what? Our young people are inventive, they're creative. All we have to do is kind of just plant this seed and watch it blossom. I mean, I have seen young people do this. If you can just kind of steer them in a direction, open their eyes maybe to something new, this stuff happens. And then it's to encourage those ideas, to encourage them. Sometimes they got to be reined in, like, no, I don't think that's going to work that way. But there are just so many ways of doing this, which is why, final thing, teachers are my heroes. They spend more time with our kids than even the parents do. And your teachers are underpaid, they're overworked, and they are the heroes. They're the ones that are, I think, saving this generation and have saved generations before. How many of you remember the names? I remember the names of my first, second, third grade teacher. I mean, that is significant stuff. So hooray for our teachers. And you need to be paid more and need to be, the respect just needs to be much more respect needs to be given to you all.
All right, I'm going to ask you one last question, then I give you time for a few words. This is just such a good question. I can't leave it. You had to make some tough decisions as a judge. How does that compare to making decisions as a parent?
Oh, so that's a great question. And I will tell you the answer. The answer is, when I was a judge, I had complete control of my courtroom. That's my house. When I came in, you stood up. And then when the bailiff said, sit down, you sat down. I tell the lawyers when to speak, when not, complete control. That is the complete opposite of parenting. Complete opposite. So I had two daughters. They were precocious. They're good people, don't get me wrong, but as far as control, especially when they hit the teen years and you're like, oh my God, all you can do at that point in my life was like, hope that I instilled the right values, cross my fingers. And it's not easy. It's just not easy. So the job of judging, much easier than raising children.
We had Dr. Ross Green on with us last week, who wrote a book called Raising Human Beings. He's wonderful. And he said, the best we can hope for as parents is to influence our children. Punishment and control don't work.
That's right.
If we could all just sort of plaster that on our foreheads, that would help, wouldn't it?
Absolutely.
So, Judge Cordell, last words. I know you've already spoken to this a bit, but I'm going to give you one more chance. Looking at our youth today, what gives you hope?
Okay. So what gives me hope? I was going to read something from the book, but I don't need it.
You can.
What gives me hope is knowing our history and knowing that we stand on the shoulders of those who came before us. If my great and great grandmothers survived enslavement so that I could be here today talking to you, having been a judge and an author, I don't know of any better way to be motivated to always move forward. If they survive that, and again, my family's not special. There are families, people who have had relatives, families who survived the Holocaust. I mean, and we're here because those folks did not give up. What could be worse than being owned by someone? Nothing. And yet they prevailed. They not just survived, they prevailed. And then here we are. So it would be an insult for us to give up hope, for us to say, oh, no, we can't do anything more. Oh, worry me. I'm going to leave this country because it's so bad. No, not at all. It would be an insult to them. So that's what motivates me, always gives me hope. Always, I am ever hopeful. So are we going to have rough times ahead? Of course we are. Of course. And so we have come from an incredible history and we're going to move forward. So that's the best thing that can give us hope is standing on the shoulders of those folks who sacrificed so that we could be here talking to one another today.
Oh, Judge LaDoris Hazzard Cordell, thank you for this brilliant conversation. It was such a pleasure again and an honor to be with you. Thank you everybody for being with us and all these wonderful questions. Wish we could have gotten to more of them. But again, thanks everybody. Hope you pick up this wonderful book. Thank you, LaDoris Cordell.
Thank you.
Good night, everybody. Take care. And we hope to see you again soon. Good night, everybody.
Thank you so much. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.